The morning of January 29th, 1944, somewhere over the frozen farmland of northern France, at 22,000 feet, Oberleutnant Klaus Heinemann was about to make a decision that violated every instinct drilled into him over 3 years of combat flying. He saw the American fighter 2 miles out, coming straight at him. A Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Big, brutish, unmistakable. In his Focke-Wulf 190, Heinemann had the altitude advantage, the experience advantage, and according to every tactical manual in the Luftwaffe, the situational advantage. The head-on pass was a test of nerve. You aimed, you fired, you committed. The first man to flinch lost. Heinemann had never flinched. But this time, at 800 meters, he broke left. Hard. The P-47 thundered past, its guns silent. It hadn't even fired. Heinemann pulled his Focke-Wulf around, hands shaking, and dove for the deck. He didn't look back. When he landed 30 minutes later at his base near Beauvais, he sat in his cockpit for a full minute before he could make his hands release the stick. The question his squadron mates asked him that evening, over weak ersatz coffee and cigarettes that tasted like sawdust, was simple. Why? The answer Heinemann gave them was simpler. I saw the wings. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what Heinemann meant, you have to understand what the P-47 Thunderbolt represented in the winter of 1944, not just as an aircraft, but as a philosophical statement about American industrial power translated into airborne violence. The Republic P-47 was not a beautiful airplane. It was a graceless, 7-ton brute that looked like someone had strapped wings to a steel water tower. When it first arrived in England in late 1942, even American pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut. Less charitably called it the 7-ton milk bottle. It was the heaviest single-seat fighter of the war. Its fuselage was so wide that ground crews joked you could walk through it. Its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2 800 Double Wasp, displaced 46 litres and produced 2,000 horsepower. For comparison, most cars of the era had engines that displaced 3 litres. But the P-47's bulk wasn't a design flaw. It was the price of capacity. Specifically, ammunition capacity. Each P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning A&M 250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. This wasn't unusual by 1944 standards. The British Spitfire Mark IX carried 2 20mm cannons and 4 .303 caliber machine guns. The German Focke-Wulf 190 typically mounted 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. Fighters on both sides had been steadily increasing their armament throughout the war. What made the P-47 different wasn't the number of guns. It was what those guns could do, all at once, for an extended period. The Browning 50 caliber machine gun, designated the A&M-2 in aircraft use, was one of the most successful weapons designs of the 20th century. It fired a cartridge 12.7mm in diameter, half an inch at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second. Each round weighed just under 2 ounces. The projectile itself was a pointed slug of hardened steel, sometimes with an incendiary or armor-piercing core, wrapped in a copper jacket. At the cyclic rate of fire, each gun fired between 700 and 850 rounds per minute. But in practice, synchronized through the aircraft's gun heaters and electrical firing system, a pilot could expect each gun to deliver about 13 rounds per second. 8 guns, 13 rounds per second, per gun. Do the math. 104 rounds per second, 6,240 rounds per minute. Every minute the trigger was depressed, the P-47 Thunderbolt threw over 200 pounds of metal downrange. But numbers on paper don't explain what Klaus Heinemann saw that morning. To understand that, you need to understand convergence. Fighter aircraft mounted their guns in the wings, and those guns were angled inward so that their lines of fire intersected at a specific distance ahead of the aircraft. This was called the convergence point. For most fighters, This was set between 200 and 300 yards, the distance at which you'd ideally engage another aircraft. American armorers typically set P-47 gun convergence at 300 yards. At that distance, all 8 gun barrels were aimed at a point in space roughly 3 feet in diameter. Every round fired would, theoretically, pass through that 3-foot circle. Now imagine you're Klaus Heinemann in a Focke-Wulf 190, flying straight at a P-47 at a combined closing speed of 600 miles per hour. That's 880 feet per second. You're covering the distance of 3 football fields every second. At 800 yards, half a mile, you can identify the enemy aircraft. At 600 yards, you're deciding whether to commit to the pass. At 400 yards, you're settling your gun sight on the target. At 300 yards, if both pilots fire at the same moment, you have exactly 1 second before you collide or break. In that 1 second, the P-47's guns would fire 104 rounds, 104 half-inch projectiles, each one capable of punching through a quarter-inch of steel plate at 500 yards, all of them aimed at a space barely wider than the wingspan of your aircraft. But it wasn't just the volume, it was the visible manifestation of that volume. Tracer rounds were loaded into ammunition belts at regular intervals, typically every 5th round for American .50 caliber ammunition. The tracer compound ignited as the round left the barrel, burning bright enough to see in daylight, creating a visible line of fire that let the pilot adjust his aim. In the P-47, with 8 guns firing and tracer loads, that meant roughly 20 visible streaks of light per second, converging on a single point. Luftwaffe pilots called it der Feuerwand, the firewall. From head-on, at convergence distance, a P-47 with all 8 guns firing looked like it was projecting a solid cone of light forward, not individual bullets. A continuous, incandescent tunnel that seemed to fill the entire forward hemisphere. Veteran German pilots described it as flying into a searchlight beam made of tracers. The psychological effect was immediate and profound. The Luftwaffe in 1944 was not the Luftwaffe of 1940. By the time Klaus Heinemann broke off his attack that January morning, the German Air Force had been fighting for 4.5 years without a meaningful break. Its pilot training program, once the envy of the world, had been stripped down to skeletal minimums. In 1940, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot received 250 to 300 hours of training before his first combat sortie. By 1944, that number had dropped to 160 hours, sometimes less. Meanwhile, attrition was catastrophic. In 1943 alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 14,000 pilots, killed, missing, or permanently disabled. That was more than the entire pilot strength of the Luftwaffe at the start of the war. Replacements arrived at frontline squadrons with barely enough experience to take off and land in formation, let alone engage in combat maneuvering against veteran American and British pilots who had, by this point, 2 years of operational experience over Europe. The aircraft situation was equally dire. German production had ramped up impressively in 1944. German factories would produce over 39,000 aircraft, more than in any previous year of the war. But they couldn't replace losses fast enough, and more critically, they couldn't produce the fuel to fly them. By January 1944, the Luftwaffe's fuel situation was approaching crisis. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, which supplied roughly 60% of Germany's petroleum, were under constant attack by American heavy bombers flying from Italy. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, massive industrial complexes that converted coal into gasoline through the Fischer-Tropsch process, were not yet under systematic attack that would come in May, but they couldn't make up the shortfall. The result was rationing. Training flights were cut, operational sorties were limited. Pilots who might once have flown 3 or 4 missions a day were now flying 1, maybe 2 if fuel stocks allowed. Combat experience, the most valuable commodity a fighter pilot could possess, was becoming impossible to acquire. And into this environment came the Americans, in numbers that defied comprehension. The United States Army Air Forces in Europe grew from effectively nothing in 1942 to the largest air armada ever assembled by January 1944. The 8th Air Force alone, operating from bases in England, fielded over 200,000 personnel, 4,000 aircraft, and 40 heavy bomber groups. Every week, weather permitting, formations of 500 to 700 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed the Channel, bound for targets deep in Germany. And escorting them, by early 1944, were the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 8th Fighter Command. The numbers were staggering. Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York, produced P-47 seconds at a rate that would have been considered impossible before the war. In 1943 alone, Republic built over 4,500 Thunderbolts. In 1944, production would peak at over 9,000 aircraft. That's 25 complete fighters rolling off the assembly line every single day, and each one carried 8 50 caliber machine guns and, in later models, 425 rounds per gun. That's 3,400 rounds of ammunition per aircraft, 25 aircraft per day, 85,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition per day, just in the newly manufactured fighters, not counting the existing fleet. The Americans weren't just winning the air war, they were drowning it in materiel. But raw numbers don't win dogfights. Pilots win dogfights. And in early 1944, despite everything, the Luftwaffe still had pilots who could win. Men like Klaus Heinemann. Heinemann's service record, like most Luftwaffe personnel files, was captured by the Allies after the war and eventually declassified. It shows a pattern common to many German fighter pilots of the period. Early success, steady accumulation of victories, then a plateau as the operational environment became increasingly hostile. He joined the Luftwaffe in 1939, trained on the Arado 66 and then the Messerschmitt 109, and received his posting to Jagdgeschwader 26 in May 1941, just in time for the opening of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. By December 1941, he had 12 confirmed victories, all against Soviet aircraft. In the West, where victory confirmation standards were stricter, that would have made him an ace twice over. He transferred to the Western Front in mid-1942 and transitioned to the Focke-Wulf 190, a newer, more powerful fighter that many Luftwaffe pilots preferred to the 109. Over the next 18 months, flying against RAF Spitfires over France and American bombers over the Reich, Heinemann added another 11 confirmed kills to his tally, 23 victories. Not enough to make him a household name in Germany. The propaganda machine preferred aces, with 50 or 100 kills, but more than enough to make him a valuable, experienced combat leader. By January 1944, Heinemann was a flight leader, commanding 4 aircraft in his staffel. He'd survived longer than most. He knew the odds. He knew what worked and what didn't. And he knew, from experience, that the head-on pass against enemy fighters was one of the most effective tactics available to a German pilot facing numerically superior Allied formations. The head-on pass exploited geometry and psychology. Most fighter combat in World War II was a pursuit problem you maneuvered to get behind the enemy, where your forward-firing guns could do their work while his couldn't touch you. But getting behind a competent enemy pilot took time, fuel, and altitude. In a swirling dogfight with multiple aircraft, you might never get the perfect deflection shot. The head-on pass simplified the problem. Both aircraft flew straight at each other. Both could fire. The convergence rate was enormous. Closing speeds often exceeded 600 miles per hour, which meant the engagement window was tiny. You had perhaps 2 seconds from effective gun range to the moment you had to break off or collide. 2 seconds to aim, fire, and hit a target that was closing at 880 feet per second. It was terrifying. It required absolute nerve. And it worked, for one simple reason. Most pilots blinked first. Human psychology, even combat-hardened human psychology, does not like the head-on collision scenario. Every instinct screams at you to break off, to evade, to survive. The pilot who could suppress that instinct, who could hold his aim while his conscious mind calculated the shrinking distance and screamed at him to turn, had an enormous advantage. The enemy would break first, exposing his belly or wing to a deflection shot. Even if neither pilot scored hits during the head-on, the moral victory went to the man who didn't flinch. German fighter pilots practiced this ruthlessly. It was doctrine. Against American bomber formations, which couldn't maneuver and had to hold their course, the head-on pass was the preferred attack method. Dive from altitude, fire into the bomber's nose, where defensive armament was lightest, then break down and away before the return fire became concentrated. Against enemy fighters, especially the heavier American types, the head-on pass was a test of will. Luftwaffe pilots believed they could win that test. They had to believe it. The alternative was admitting that they were outmatched, outgunned, and losing. But by January 1944, more and more German pilots were reaching the same conclusion Klaus Heinemann reached that morning over northern France. The P-47 Thunderbolt had changed the equation. The gun placement on the P-47 was not accidental. Republic Aviation's designers, led by Alexander Kartveli, had made specific choices to maximize the aircraft's hitting power. Unlike some fighters, which mounted guns in the fuselage where they fired through the propeller arc using synchronization gear, the P-47 mounted all 8 guns in the wings. This meant no synchronization losses. The guns could fire at their full cyclic rate. It also meant the guns could be placed far apart, creating a wider cone of fire before convergence. The 4 guns in each wing were stacked 2 above, 2 below, in a tight package just outboard of the landing gear. The ammunition boxes for these guns took up almost the entire volume of the inner wing. Each gun was belt-fed from a box containing between 267 and 425 rounds, depending on the model and configuration. The belts were metal-linked and required careful loading to prevent jams, but once loaded, they were extraordinarily reliable. The guns themselves were heated electrically. At 20,000 feet, where air temperatures dropped to 30 or 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, metal contracted, oil thickened, and mechanical actions slowed. Frozen guns were useless guns. The P-47's electrical heating system kept each gun's action warm enough to cycle reliably, even in the thin, cold air of high-altitude combat. The result was a weapon system that could sustain fire for longer than almost any other fighter in the sky. At full cyclic rate, 3,400 rounds of ammunition gave a P-47 pilot roughly 33 seconds of trigger time before his guns ran dry. That doesn't sound like much. In fighter combat, it was an eternity. Most fighter engagements involved trigger bursts of 1 to 3 seconds. That's all you needed if your aim was good. But it also meant you had to be certain of your shot before you committed ammunition. Spray and pray was a quick way to return to base with empty guns and nothing to show for it. The P-47 gave its pilots options. You could fire short, precise bursts and conserve ammunition for multiple engagements. Or, if the tactical situation demanded it, you could hold the trigger down and walk a stream of tracers onto a target, adjusting your aim in real time as the bullets flew. Few other fighters had that luxury, and in a head-on pass, where the engagement window was measured in seconds and fractions of seconds, the P-47 pilot had a psychological weapon that went beyond ballistics. He knew that if he committed to the pass, if he pointed his nose at the enemy and pressed the trigger at 400 yards, he would fill the space between himself and the enemy with over 400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition in the 4 seconds before they reached collision distance. 400 rounds. 400 chances to hit. 400 projectiles, each capable of severing a control cable, puncturing a fuel tank, shattering an engine block, or killing a pilot outright. And the enemy pilot, looking down that cone of tracers, knew it too. The first documented cases of Luftwaffe pilots refusing head-on passes against P-47 seconds appeared in after-action reports and intelligence summaries in late 1943. They were anecdotal at first, individual pilots reporting that enemy fighters had broken off attacks prematurely, or that aggressive pursuit had suddenly ceased when the P-47 seconds turned to engage head-on. By early 1944, the pattern was consistent enough that it appeared in formal intelligence assessments. A report from the 8th Air Force's Directorate of Intelligence, dated February 19, 1944, noted, German fighter pilots appear increasingly reluctant to press home attacks when opposed by P-47 formations employing head-on tactics. On multiple occasions, enemy aircraft have been observed to break off attacks at ranges of 500 to 1,000 yards when confronted with direct forward fire. The report was clinical, almost dry. It didn't attempt to explain why, it simply recorded the fact. But the pilots knew why. Captain Robert S. Johnson, a P-47 pilot with the 56th Fighter Group, was one of the top American aces in the European theatre, with 27 confirmed victories. In his post-war memoir, he described a head-on engagement with a Focke-Wulf 190 over Germany in March 1944. He came at me from 12 o'clock high, diving with the sun behind him. Classic bounce. I saw him at about 2 miles and turned into him. We were head-on, closing at, 600 miles an hour, maybe more. I put the gun sight on his nose and waited. At about 500 yards, I started firing. Short bursts. Then I just held the trigger down. I could see my tracers converging right where he was going to be. And then, maybe 300 yards out, he snapped into a vertical bank and dove away. Just gone. He didn't fire a shot. I don't think he even armed his guns. Johnson's wingman confirmed the account. The Focke-Wulf had altitude, position, and surprise. By every tactical measure, it should have pressed the attack. Instead, it disengaged before firing. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was becoming standard. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine, codified in training manuals and reinforced through years of combat experience, had always emphasized aggression. The Bf-109 and W-190 were designed as offensive weapons. Their climb rates, roll rates, and acceleration characteristics rewarded pilots who seized the initiative. The standard fighter tactics, the boom and zoom attack from altitude, the head-on pass, the high-speed slashing attack, all presumed that the German pilot would press home his assault with maximum aggression. By spring 1944, that doctrine was colliding with a reality that no amount of training or ideological conditioning could override: self-preservation. Major Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe ace who survived the war with 176 confirmed victories, later wrote about this shift in his memoir. Steinhoff commanded Jagdgeschwader 77 on the Eastern Front before transferring west in early 1944. His observations were blunt. We knew the Americans had superior numbers. We knew their aircraft were being improved constantly, longer range, better engines, more ammunition. What we didn't expect was the psychological effect of their armament. When you see 850 caliber guns opening up on you from head-on, your rational mind tells you to hold course and fire back. But something deeper, something survival-oriented, makes you break. It's not cowardice. It's mathematics. You cannot trade shots with an aircraft that throws twice your weight of fire. Steinhoff was describing a phenomenon that military psychologists would later term firepower asymmetry stress, the cognitive load imposed on a combatant who recognizes, in real time, that he is outmatched in a direct engagement. The Germans weren't unfamiliar with heavy firepower. The Fail W-190A, 8, one of the most common variants in service by mid-1944, typically carried 4 MG-151 20mm cannons and 2 MG-131 13mm machine guns. On paper, this was devastating. 20mm explosive shells were far more destructive per hit than 50 caliber bullets. A single 20mm hit could destroy a fighter's wing or engine. American pilots feared the German cannons. But there were trade-offs. The MG-151 cannon fired at a cyclic rate of approximately 750 rounds per minute. Each W-190 carried between 250 and 300 rounds per cannon, depending on the installation. That gave each cannon about 20 to 24 seconds of fire time. The ammunition was heavy. A 20mm shell weighed 5 times as much as a 50 caliber round, which limited how much could be carried. More critically, the rate of fire was lower. and the dispersion pattern was wider. 4 cannons, firing 750 rounds per minute, each produced 50 rounds per second total. Compared to the P-47's 104 rounds per second, that was roughly half the volume. The difference became pronounced at convergence range. The P-47's 8 guns, firing in tight synchronization, created a pattern of fire so dense that it approached what gunnery theorists called saturation, the point at which the target area is so thoroughly covered by projectiles that evasion becomes statistically improbable. A 190 pilot could, theoretically, fly through a stream of 50 caliber fire and not be hit. It was unlikely, but possible. The gaps between bullets were large enough that a small maneuvering target could slip through. But when over 100 rounds per second are being fired at a convergence point 3 feet wide, and you're flying a fighter with a wingspan of 34 feet, the math stops being theoretical. You're not dodging bullets anymore. You're flying through a probability field where the odds of being hit approach certainty. The Luftwaffe pilots understood this instinctively, even if they couldn't articulate it in statistical terms. They understood it the same way a soldier understands, on some primal level, the difference between rifle fire and machine gun fire. Volume matters, density matters. And when the volume and density reach a certain threshold, tactics that work against normal firepower stop working. The head-on pass stopped working. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By April 1944, the shift in Luftwaffe tactics was evident in the combat reports filed by American fighter groups. Engagements that began with German fighters holding altitude advantage and position increasingly ended with those fighters disengaging when P-47 seconds turned to meet them head-on. The 56th Fighter Group, based at Boxted in England, compiled statistics from their missions between January and June 1944. Out of 112 recorded instances where P-47 seconds turned into head-on attacks against German fighters, 73 resulted in the German aircraft breaking off before reaching effective firing range. That's a 65% disengagement rate. For context, in the 6 months prior July through December 1943, the same group recorded a disengagement rate of 38% under similar circumstances. The Germans were becoming noticeably more reluctant to press attacks. This wasn't universal. Some German pilots, particularly the aces with dozens of kills and years of experience, still engaged aggressively. Major Heinz Baer, an ace with over 200 victories, continued to use head-on tactics against American fighters throughout 1944. But Baer was exceptional. He was also flying a Tupolev U-190A8 that had been specially modified with extra armor plating around the cockpit and engine, a field modification known as Sturmbok that turned the fighter into a semi-armored attack aircraft specifically designed to close with and destroy heavy bombers. Most Luftwaffe pilots didn't have that protection. They had standard fighters, diminishing fuel reserves, inadequate training, and an increasingly clear understanding that the tactical playbook they'd been given was written for a war that no longer existed. The psychological impact went beyond individual engagements. It affected mission planning, formation discipline, and ultimately, effectiveness. German fighter controllers, coordinating intercepts from ground stations, began reporting difficulty getting their pilots to commit to attacks on bomber formations when those formations were escorted by P-47 seconds. The fighters would climb to altitude, position themselves for an attack, then orbit out of range, waiting for an opening that never came. By the time the German fighters worked up the nerve to engage, the bombers had often passed their target and were turning for home, and the American escorts had enough fuel to stay with them. Fuel was always the limiting factor. A FW-190A8 had an internal fuel capacity of about 114 gallons, which gave it a combat radius of roughly 350 miles. A P-47D, by contrast, carried 370 gallons internally, and could carry 2 external drop tanks of up to 150 gallons each. Even after dropping the external tanks to engage in combat, the P-47 had more fuel than a FW-190 started with. This meant that in any extended engagement, Time favored the Americans. German pilots knew that if they circled, waiting for an advantage, they were burning fuel they'd need to get home. American pilots could afford to wait. They could maintain formation, keep the bombers covered, and force the Germans to either attack on unfavorable terms or not at all. More often than not, the Germans chose not at all. This dynamic created a self-reinforcing cycle. German pilots who refused to press attacks survived longer. They returned to base, reported successful defensive patrols, and flew again the next day. Pilots who pressed attacks aggressively against well-armed, well-escorted formations tended not to return. The lessons learned from survival were therefore fundamentally defensive. Avoid direct confrontation, wait for stragglers, pick off damaged bombers on the return flight. But the strategic effect was the same as defeat. If the bombers reached their targets, dropped their ordnance, and returned home, it didn't matter how many German fighters survived. The mission had failed, and the bombers kept getting through. The lethality of the P-47's armament wasn't theoretical. It was documented in grim detail in the gun camera footage, damage assessment reports, and wreckage analysis conducted by both sides. American gun camera film from P-47 engagements shows the effects clearly. The cameras, mounted in the wing and synchronized to run when the guns fired, recorded what happened when 100+ rounds per second hit a target. The typical engagement sequence lasted 3 to 5 seconds. The camera shows the enemy aircraft, centered in frame, growing larger as the range closes. Then the tracers appear bright streaks converging on the target. Then impacts, flashes, and puffs of debris as 50 caliber rounds punch through aluminum skin and structure. Then, almost always, one of three things: the enemy aircraft trailing smoke, the enemy aircraft shedding pieces, or the enemy aircraft disintegrating. Disintegration was more common with the P-47 than with most other fighters, and for a simple reason: sustained fire. Other fighters might score hits with a 1-second burst, damaging the enemy but not destroying it outright. The P-47, with its massive ammunition capacity, could hold the trigger down for 3, 4, 5 seconds, walking the stream of fire across the target as it maneuvered, ensuring not just hits but multiple, overlapping, hits on critical structures. A FAFO 190's wing spar, the main structural beam that held the wing together, was made of steel and aluminum. It was designed to handle enormous loads, G-forces, high-speed maneuvers, combat damage, but it wasn't designed to handle 30 or 40 50 caliber rounds impacting the same general area in rapid succession. 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds could penetrate half an inch of steel at 500 yards. At 300 yards convergence range, they could penetrate 3/4 of an inch. The TFW 190's wing spar was approximately 3/8 of an inch thick at its strongest point. Do the math. Each round that hit the spar went through it. If enough rounds hit the same section, the spar failed. When the spar failed, the wing separated from the fuselage. When the wing separated, the aircraft entered an uncontrollable spin or tumble. At high speed, the resulting aerodynamic forces tended to tear the rest of the aircraft apart. Luftwaffe loss reports from 1944 include hundreds of entries describing fighters that broke up in flight or lost wing in combat. These weren't always due to P-47 fire, specifically, but the correlation was noted. American pilots referred to it as sawing the wing off. That's what it looked like on gun camera film, a sustained burst that literally cut through the wing structure until it gave way. The psychological impact of witnessing this, either as a victim who survived, rare, or as a wingman who watched his comrade's aircraft come apart, was profound. Obergefreiter Franz Stiegler, a Bf 109 pilot who survived the war, described watching a fellow pilot's aircraft hit by P-47 fire during an engagement over Bavaria in May 1944. We were attacking a bomber formation from the side, 4 of us. The Americans had escorts above us, but we thought we could get in and out before they reached us. We were wrong. 2 P-47 seconds dove on us from our 7 o'clock high. I saw them and called a break, But Heinrich Lieutenant Schmidt was focused on his attack. He didn't see them. The first burst hit his engine. I saw pieces of cowling fly off. Then the second burst walked up his fuselage to the wing root. His left wing folded up, just folded. Like paper, the fuselage rolled right and went straight down. No shoot. I broke off my attack and dove for the deck. I didn't even think. I just ran. Stigler flew 42 more combat missions after that incident. He never attempted another attack on a bomber formation that had P-47 escorts. The effect on morale was compounded by the information deficit the Germans faced. Unlike the Americans and British, who had sophisticated intelligence networks and regularly debriefed captured Luftwaffe pilots, the Germans had limited insight into American aircraft specifications and combat capabilities. Much of what Luftwaffe pilots knew about American fighters came from direct experience, rumor, and propaganda, none of which were particularly reliable. German propaganda, especially by 1944, had become so disconnected from reality that it served primarily to demoralize rather than encourage. Radio broadcasts and newspaper articles continued to describe American equipment as inferior, poorly built, and ineffective. These claims were contradicted by every pilot who actually encountered American fighters in combat. The cognitive dissonance was significant. If the propaganda was true, why were German pilots losing? If American aircraft were inferior, why did they have longer range, heavier armament, and better high-altitude performance? If American pilots were poorly trained, why were they consistently outmaneuvering Luftwaffe formations? The official answer, delivered through channels both formal and informal, was that German pilots weren't trying hard enough. They lacked fighting spirit. They were defeatist. This was, of course, absurd. The Luftwaffe pilots of 1944 were fighting against overwhelming odds with inadequate resources and still managing to inflict significant casualties on Allied air forces. But absurdity was a feature, not a bug, of late-war German leadership. The result was a profound sense of isolation among frontline pilots. They couldn't trust the information they received from above. They couldn't trust their equipment to be maintained or their fuel allocations to be consistent. And increasingly, they couldn't trust that the tactics they'd been taught would keep them alive. In that environment, the decision to break off a head-on pass against a P-47 wasn't cowardice. It was sanity. The technical specifications of the P-47's armament created a specific tactical vulnerability for German fighters that had nothing to do with the pilot's skill or courage. It was purely mechanical, and it exploited a design choice that had made perfect sense in 1939, but had become a liability by 1944. German fighters, particularly the Bf 109, were designed with lightweight construction as a primary goal. The Messerschmitt 109's empty weight was just over 4,000 pounds. The Fuhr W190 was heavier at about 7,000 pounds. Both aircraft achieved their performance high speed, excellent climb rate, good maneuverability by minimizing structural weight wherever possible. This meant thin skin. The aluminum alloy panels that covered the fuselage and wings of German fighters were typically 1 to 2 millimeters thick, about the thickness of a credit card. This was adequate for normal flight loads and even for glancing hits from rifle-caliber ammunition. It was not adequate for 50-caliber machine gun fire. American engineers, designing the P-47 several years later, and with the benefit of combat reports from the European and Pacific theaters, made different choices. The Thunderbolt's fuselage skin was thicker up to 4 millimeters in critical areas. Its engine was protected by a massive cowling that doubled as armor. The pilot sat in an armored bathtub made of 1/8-inch steel plate. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, with multiple layers of rubber that automatically closed punctures. The result was an aircraft that weighed 7 tons empty, but could absorb damage that would destroy lighter fighters. P-47 seconds routinely returned to base with dozens of holes in their wings and fuselage, with cylinders shot off their engines, with control cables severed. The aircraft's sheer mass and redundancy kept it flying. German fighters didn't have that luxury. A single 50 caliber round through the engine block could sever a piston, crack the crankcase, or rupture oil lines. The Daimler-Benz 600 series engine used in the Bf 109 was a marvel of precision engineering, but precision engineering is fragile. One round in the wrong place and the engine seized. When a fighter's engine seized at 20,000 feet over enemy territory, the pilot had two options: glide toward friendly lines and hope to reach them, or bail out and become a prisoner. Neither was appealing. The TAV W190's BMW 801 radial engine was more robust. Radial engines are generally more damage-tolerant than inline engines, because losing one cylinder doesn't necessarily stop the others. But even the BMW 801 couldn't survive sustained hits from 50 caliber fire. And the W190 had a vulnerability. The Bf 109 didn't. Its fuel tanks were located in the fuselage directly behind the engine. A burst that hit the engine had a good chance of continuing through into the fuel tank. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard on late-war WW190 seconds, but they could only seal small punctures. Multiple hits or hits from incendiary rounds overwhelmed the sealing mechanism. When that happened, fuel sprayed into the engine compartment, ignited, and the aircraft burned. Luftwaffe pilots knew this. They'd seen it happen to their comrades. They'd smelled the aviation fuel burning, seen the black smoke, heard the screaming on the radio as a pilot tried to decide whether to stay with his burning aircraft and try to land or bail out and risk the parachute catching fire. And they knew that the P-47, with its 8 guns and its massive ammunition capacity, was extremely good at causing exactly that kind of damage. So when Klaus Heinemann broke left that morning in January 1944, he wasn't making a split-second decision. He was making a calculated choice based on experience, observation, and a realistic assessment of his chances. He'd seen what P-47 seconds did to fighters that pressed head-on attacks. He'd attended the funerals, he'd read the loss reports, and he decided, in that moment, that today was not the day he joined them. The shift in German fighter tactics didn't go unnoticed by Allied intelligence. By summer 1944, analysis sections at both the 8th Air Force and RAF Fighter Command had compiled enough data to recognize a pattern. A report from the Allied Central Interpretation Unit, dated July 15, 1944, stated, "Analysis of combat film and pilot debriefings indicates a marked change in Luftwaffe fighter tactics, beginning approximately January 1944. Enemy fighters show increased reluctance to engage in head-on attacks against P-47 formations. When such engagements do occur, enemy aircraft typically break off at ranges greater than 400 yards before reaching effective firing distance." The report went on to note that this reluctance did not extend to attacks against bomber formations, where German fighters continued to press attacks aggressively, particularly from head-on aspects where bomber defensive fire was weakest. The distinction was clear. German pilots would still risk head-on passes against bombers, which couldn't maneuver and had limited forward-firing armament, but they wouldn't risk them against P-47 seconds. This had immediate tactical implications. American fighter groups adjusted their escort procedures to exploit this reluctance. Instead of flying top cover at high altitude, waiting for German fighters to initiate attacks, P-47 squadrons began flying closer to the bomber formations and actively turning into any German fighters that approached. The tactic, called offensive escort, transformed the fighter's role from passive protector to active threat. If a German formation approached the bombers from 10 o'clock high, the P-47 seconds would turn to meet them head-on, forcing the Germans to either engage on unfavorable terms or break off entirely. The Germans usually broke off. This had a cascading effect on bomber loss rates. In the first quarter of 1944, the 8th Air Force lost an average of 4.2% of aircraft dispatched per mission. By the third quarter, after the widespread adoption of offensive escort tactics by P-47 and P-51 groups, that rate had dropped to 2.1%. The bombers were getting through, and more importantly, they were getting home. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany's industrial base, oil production, and transportation network accelerated throughout 1944. By September, Allied bombers were flying missions deep into Germany with near impunity. The Luftwaffe still fought it would continue fighting until the last days of the war, but its effectiveness as a defensive force had been catastrophically degraded. And while many factors contributed to that degradation, fuel shortages, pilot losses, industrial bombing, one factor was the simple, demonstrable fact that German pilots had stopped pressing attacks against one of the most common American escort fighters. They'd stopped because the cost of pressing those attacks had become prohibitive. And the cost had become prohibitive because the P-47 Thunderbolt threw more lead, more accurately, for longer, than any fighter aircraft in the sky. By autumn 1944, the P-47 was being replaced in the escort role by the P-51 Mustang, which had longer range and better high-altitude performance. The Thunderbolt was reassigned to ground attack duties, where its ruggedness, heavy armament, and ability to carry bombs and rockets made it devastatingly effective. But the psychological impact of those 850 caliber guns lingered. German pilots who'd faced P-47 seconds in 1944 and survived carried that experience with them for the rest of the war. They knew what concentrated firepower looked like. They knew what it felt like to see that cone of tracers converging on them. And they knew, from direct observation, that trying to outwill a P-47 inches a head-on pass was a quick way to die. Franz Stigler, the Bf-109 pilot who watched his wingman's aircraft disintegrate under P-47 fire, survived the war. He was shot down 4 times, wounded twice, and ended the war with 28 confirmed victories. In a post-war interview conducted in 1987, he was asked what the most frightening thing he'd experienced in combat was. His answer: "Looking down the barrels of a P-47's guns, you couldn't see the individual guns, of course, but you could see the wings, and you knew what was in those wings. 850s, and if he pulled the trigger, everything in front of him died. So you didn't let him pull the trigger. You broke, you ran, and you lived to fight another day. There's no shame in that. That's just mathematics." The mathematics were brutal and simple. 104 rounds per second, concentrated in a 3-foot circle, for up to 33 seconds of continuous fire. Against that, no amount of courage or skill mattered. You either avoided the fire or you died. The Luftwaffe's refusal to press head-on attacks against P-47 seconds wasn't a failure of morale. It was a recognition of reality. The Americans had built a fighter that redefined what heavy armament meant, and in doing so, they'd created a psychological weapon as effective as any physical one. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt flew its last combat mission over Europe on May 7, 1945, the day before Germany's unconditional surrender. By that point, over 15,000 Thunderbolts had been produced, and they'd flown more than 546,000 combat sorties across all theatres of operation. They'd claimed nearly 4,000 air-to-air victories and destroyed thousands of ground targets, trains, trucks, tanks, artillery positions, bridges. But those numbers, impressive as they are, don't capture the aircraft's most significant contribution to the Allied victory. That contribution was psychological, not material, and it played out in thousands of individual decisions made by German pilots over the course of 18 months. Every time a Luftwaffe pilot saw a P-47 formation and chose to maintain his distance rather than attack, every time a flight leader positioned his squadron for a bomber intercept but broke off when American escorts turned to engage head-on, every time a young pilot, fresh from a truncated training program, looked at those thick wings and decided he'd rather face a court-martial than fly into that wall of fire. Each of those moments represented a small tactical defeat for Germany. Collectively, they represented something larger, the erosion of the Luftwaffe's offensive capability. By late 1944, the German Air Force was fighting a purely defensive war. It couldn't escort its own bombers. Germany had effectively ceased strategic bombing operations. It couldn't prevent Allied aircraft from ranging freely over German territory. And critically, it couldn't stop the steady attrition of its pilot corps through a combination of combat losses, fuel shortages, and the simple psychological exhaustion of fighting a losing battle. The 850 caliber guns of the P-47 didn't cause all of that, but they contributed. They contributed by making one of the Luftwaffe's most reliable tactics, the aggressive head-on attack, into a near-suicidal proposition. And when you take away a fighter pilot's ability to attack aggressively, you've fundamentally changed what he can accomplish. The men who flew the P-47 inches combat understood what they had. They understood it viscerally, in a way that no amount of technical briefing could convey. They understood it the first time they pressed the trigger and felt the aircraft shudder as 8 guns opened up simultaneously. They understood it when they watched their gun camera footage and saw what 30 or 40 rounds did to an enemy aircraft's wing structure. And they understood it when they saw German fighters break off attacks rather than face that fire. Colonel Hubert Hub, Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, was one of the most successful P-47 pilots of the war. He scored 17 3/4 confirmed victories and led his group to become the highest-scoring P-47 unit in the European theatre. In his post-war memoirs, Zemke wrote about the psychological advantage the P-47's armament provided. "We knew we had the firepower edge. Every pilot in the group knew it. And more importantly, the Germans knew it. You could see it in how they fought. They'd make one pass, maybe 2 if they were determined. But then they'd break off. They wouldn't stay and mix it up like they used to. Some of our guys thought the Luftwaffe was losing its nerve. Maybe they were. But if you'd been on the receiving end of 850s, you'd understand why." Zemke's observation touches on something important. The P-47's firepower didn't just change German tactics, it changed German psychology. It introduced an element of doubt into engagements that should have been straightforward. And doubt, in aerial combat where decisions are made in fractions of a second, is often fatal. A pilot who doubts whether he should press an attack hesitates. A pilot who hesitates gives his opponent time to maneuver, to gain position, to fire first. In the high-speed, 3-dimensional chess game of fighter combat, hesitation cascades. One moment of uncertainty leads to a defensive position, which leads to an energy disadvantage, which leads to disengagement or death. The Germans had trained their pilots to be aggressive, to seize initiative, to attack without hesitation. But training can only overcome instinct up to a point, and the instinct to avoid overwhelming firepower is one of the strongest survival mechanisms humans possess. The post-war interrogation of Luftwaffe personnel provided additional insight into how German pilots perceived American fighter armament. These interrogations, conducted by Allied intelligence officers between May and December 1945, included detailed questions about tactics, training, equipment, and combat experiences. One interrogation report, filed September 23, 1945, summarized the testimony of Hauptmann Werner Schroer, an ace with 114 confirmed victories, most of them scored on the Eastern Front. Schroer had transferred to the Western Front in March 1944 and flew against American fighters until being shot down and captured in January 1945. When asked about tactical differences between Eastern and Western Front combat, Schroer stated, "In the East, you could press an attack and trust your aircraft's performance and your skill to carry you through. The Russians had numbers, but not always quality. In the West, against the Americans, skill wasn't enough. They had quality, numbers, and firepower that exceeded anything we could match, the P-47 especially. You didn't attack a P-47 head-on unless you had no choice. The risk was too high." Pressed to elaborate, Schroer described an engagement over Holland in August 1944, where his Schwarm, a flight of 4 4-11W 190 seconds, encountered a formation of 12 P-47 seconds, escorting bombers. Schroer's flight had altitude and position. They should have had every advantage. But when they dove to attack, the P-47 seconds turned to meet them head-on, and Schroer's formation scattered without firing a shot. My wingman said over the radio, "I can't do it. I can't fly into that." And he broke off. The other element followed him. I was left alone, diving at 12 P-47 seconds. I'm not a coward, but I'm also not insane. I broke off too. We climbed back to altitude and followed the formation from a distance until they turned for home. We reported an inconclusive engagement. The truth was, we hadn't even tried. Schroer's testimony was consistent with dozens of other interrogations. German pilots repeatedly emphasized the psychological impact of American heavy fighter armament. Some were more explicit than others, but the theme was constant. Facing a P-47 head-on felt different from facing other Allied fighters. It felt more dangerous. And that feeling, regardless of whether it was always justified by objective analysis, influenced tactical decisions. The engineering philosophy behind the P-47's armament was distinctly American. It reflected both the United States' industrial capacity and a particular approach to solving military problems. If some is good, more is better. Other nations, facing resource constraints or different tactical requirements, made different choices. The British, for example, experimented with heavy armament on fighters like the Hawker Typhoon, which mounted 4 20mm cannons. But they also maintained fighters like the Spitfire with mixed armament, 2 cannons and 4 machine guns, prioritizing a balance between hitting power and ammunition capacity. The Germans, as previously noted, favored heavy cannons over machine guns, accepting lower rates of fire in exchange for greater destructive power per hit. This made sense given their tactical requirements. Against bombers, where each shot needed to inflict catastrophic damage to bring down a large, multi-engine aircraft, cannons were essential. Against fighters, the calculus was more complex, but German doctrine still favored the knockout punch over sustained fire. The Americans, with access to essentially unlimited industrial production capacity, didn't have to choose. They could build fighters that carried enough ammunition to sustain fire for 30 seconds or more. They could equip those fighters with 8 guns instead of 4. They could accept the weight penalty, and the P-47 was heavy because they had engines powerful enough to overcome it. This wasn't just American excess. It was a deliberate design philosophy based on combat analysis. American engineers and tacticians studied gun camera footage, loss reports, and pilot debriefings from early air combat in Europe and the Pacific. They noted that most kills occurred not from single, well-aimed shots, but from sustained bursts that scored multiple hits. They noted that fighters with higher ammunition capacity could remain in combat zones longer, providing extended escort coverage. And they noted that psychological effects, the visible stream of tracers, the sound of sustained fire, had measurable impacts on enemy behavior. The P-47 was the embodiment of those lessons. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient in the classical sense, but it was devastatingly effective, and effectiveness was what mattered. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The Luftwaffe, as a fighting force, had effectively ceased to exist weeks earlier. In the final months of the war, fuel shortages had become so severe that many German fighter units couldn't fly at all. Those that did operate flew sporadically, with minimal coordination and diminishing effectiveness. The jet fighters that Germany introduced in the war's final year, the Messerschmitt Me 262, the Arado R 234, represented technological breakthroughs, but they came too late and in too few numbers to alter the strategic situation. And even these advanced aircraft couldn't overcome the fundamental problem facing German fighter pilots. They were outnumbered, outproduced, and fighting over their own territory with nowhere to retreat. But in the 18 months between January 1944 and the war's end, the psychological dynamic created by the P-47's overwhelming firepower played a measurable role in the Luftwaffe's decline. It didn't win the war by itself, no single weapon system ever does. But it changed the calculus of aerial combat in ways that favored the Allies and penalized the Germans. It made aggressive attacks riskier, it made defensive flying more appealing, it rewarded caution over boldness. And in a military culture that had built its identity around aggressive offensive action, that shift was corrosive. Klaus Heinemann, the Luftwaffe pilot whose story opened this narrative, survived the war. His service record shows he flew combat missions until April 19, 1945, when his unit disbanded due to fuel shortages. He was never shot down, never seriously wounded, and credited with 23 confirmed victories, a respectable total for a pilot who spent most of the war on the defensive. After the war, Heinemann returned to civilian life, worked as an engineer, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences. But in 1978, he was interviewed by a historian researching Luftwaffe tactics on the Western Front. The interview was brief, less than an hour, but Heinemann was candid in ways that many veterans were not. When asked about the decision to break off his attack that morning in January 1944, Heinemann was matter-of-fact. "I'd seen what those guns could do. I'd picked through the wreckage of 10 Ampli 192nd that had tried to go head-to-head with P-47 2. The wings were shredded, like someone had taken a saw to them, and I thought, what's the point? Even if I get my shots off, even if I hit him, he's going to hit me, and he's going to hit me with 8 guns to my 6. The math doesn't work. So I broke off, and I lived. A lot of my friends didn't." The interviewer pressed. Did he consider it cowardice? Heinemann's response, "No, I consider it mathematics. And common sense. The Americans built a better weapon. We couldn't match it. That's not cowardice. That's reality. You can call it defeatism if you want. I call it survival. I had a wife. I wanted to see her again. Flying into those guns would have ensured I didn't. So I didn't fly into them. Simple." His words encapsulate the central irony of this story. The Luftwaffe, an air force built on aggression and offensive doctrine, was psychologically defeated in part by a weapon that didn't need to be fired to be effective. The mere presence of those 8 guns, the visible threat they represented, was often enough to change pilot behavior. This wasn't universal. As noted, some pilots continued to attack aggressively throughout the war, but the trend was clear and documented. More German pilots, more often, chose not to press attacks when faced with P-47 formations, and each of those individual decisions accumulated into a strategic effect. The gradual erosion of the Luftwaffe's ability to contest airspace over Europe. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt remained in service with various air forces well into the 1950s. After the war, many were sold or given to allied nations, France, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, and others. Some saw combat in subsequent conflicts, including the Chinese Civil War and various Latin American disputes. But by the late 1950s, the advent of jet fighters had rendered the P-47 obsolete, and most were retired or scrapped. Today, fewer than 10 airworthy P-47 2s exist worldwide. They're museum pieces, airshow attractions, reminders of an era when air combat was conducted at 300 miles per hour with guns instead of missiles, and when a pilot's survival depended as much on his nerve as his skill. But the lessons of the P-47's design endure. Modern fighter aircraft still prioritize firepower, though the mechanisms have changed. Cannons have given way to missiles, and missiles have given way to beyond visual range weapons that destroy targets from dozens of miles away. But the fundamental principle remains. In combat, the side that can deliver more destructive force, more accurately for longer, has a decisive advantage, not just materially, but psychologically. The P-47 demonstrated that principle in the most direct way possible. It didn't rely on technological sophistication or aerodynamic elegance. It relied on brute force 8 machine guns firing 104 rounds per second and on the very human response to overwhelming firepower. That response, as Klaus Heinemann and thousands of other Luftwaffe pilots discovered, was to flinch, to break, to disengage, not because they lacked courage, but because they understood, at a visceral level, that flying into that wall of lead was suicide, and in war, survival is its own form of victory. Even when it means refusing to fight. The historical record of the air war over Europe in 1944 is vast and complex. Thousands of missions, tens of thousands of individual engagements, millions of rounds fired. In that enormous tapestry of violence, the specific phenomenon of Luftwaffe pilots, Refusing head-on passes against P-47 seconds might seem like a minor detail, but minor details accumulate. They create patterns. And patterns reveal truths about how wars are actually fought, as opposed to how we imagine they're fought. We imagine wars are won by bravery, skill, and determination. And they are, in part, but they're also won by logistics, industrial capacity, and the slow accumulation of small advantages. The P-47's 850 caliber guns represented exactly that kind of small advantage. Each individual engagement where a German pilot chose not to attack was insignificant, but over 18 months, those engagements added up to a fundamental shift in the air war's dynamics. The bombers got through, the factories were destroyed, the oil refineries stopped producing, the transportation network collapsed, and Germany lost. The P-47 didn't win the war, but it contributed to that victory in ways both material and psychological. It shot down fighters and destroyed ground targets, and it convinced enemy pilots that some attacks weren't worth making. In the end, that might have been its greatest weapon, not the guns themselves, but what the guns represented. The visible, undeniable proof that America could build, in enormous numbers, an aircraft that threw more lead than any fighter in history. And when German pilots saw that cone of tracers converging on them, they understood what it meant. They understood that behind those 8 guns was an industrial base that could produce thousands of fighters, millions of rounds of ammunition, and an endless supply of pilots trained to use them. They understood they were fighting a war they couldn't win, and understanding that, many of them chose to live rather than die proving a point. That wasn't cowardice, that was wisdom. And wisdom, in the end, is what separates the survivors from the casualties. Klaus Heinemann broke left, dove for the deck, and flew home. He lived to see his wife again, to see Germany surrender, to build a life in the decades of peace that followed. The P-47 pilot he refused to engage that morning never knew how close he came to combat. He continued his patrol, escorted his bombers to the target and back, and landed safely at his base in England. In his mission report, filed that evening, he noted, "Bandits sighted but did not engage. 2 pilots, 2 aircraft, 1 moment of decision. Multiply that moment by thousands. Stretch it across 18 months, and you begin to understand how wars are won and lost, not always in dramatic battles, but in countless small moments where men choose survival over glory." The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its 850 caliber guns and its 33 seconds of sustained fire, created those moments. It created them not through propaganda or morale building or tactical genius, but through raw, visible, undeniable firepower. 3,400 rounds per minute, combined, 104 rounds per second, all converging on a point in space 3 feet wide. The Luftwaffe pilots saw it, they understood it, and they refused to fly into it. That refusal, more than any single battle or technological breakthrough, marked the beginning of the end of German air superiority over Europe. And it all came down to 8 guns, 8 pieces of machinery, designed in Connecticut, manufactured in New York, mounted in the wings of a 7-ton fighter, and operated by young men who believed in the mission they'd been given. Those guns didn't just shoot down enemy aircraft, they changed how enemy pilots thought about combat. They introduced doubt where there had been certainty. They made the aggressor hesitate. And in aerial combat, hesitation is often fatal not because you get shot down, but because you never engage in the first place. The P-47's greatest victory wasn't measured in kill counts or mission reports, it was measured in the attacks that never happened. The bombers that reached their targets unmolested, the pilots who returned home because the enemy chose not to fight. You can't put that in a museum, you can't display it at an air show. But it was real, it was documented, and it mattered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.